Peace, y'all. This is Marcus Sunjata Brown coming to you with the second installation in my Nkrumah series. In this episode, installation, I don't know what to call it, we're just going to very quickly talk about Nkrumah's development from a doctoral student and an apprentice revolutionary into a leader for the Gold Coast independence struggle. Okay. So in the last video, we did say a little bit about the early development of Nkrumah. We talked about the fact that he was doing doctoral work in philosophy at University College in London, and that he was also a bit conflicted because on the one hand, he was somebody of a very practical cast of mind in terms of trying to get liberation for Black people, but at the same time he also had this very strong theoretical bent, and he wanted to think through the problems of revolution, but not just that, thinking through the basic questions of human existence and how they related to the emancipation struggle of Africans in the 20th century. Okay, so A.J. Ayer, who was the analytical philosopher at University College that was supervising his dissertation work, once claimed that he couldn't say that Nkrumah was a first-rate philosopher or first-rate thinker because he seemed to be preoccupied with his prospects in the African liberation movement, and that he couldn't devote enough time toward, purely speculative problems. But there were a number of texts that were published after the independence movement, such as Towards Colonial Freedom and most famously Consciencism, which we'll say more about in a future video, that give the lie to A.J. Ayer's assessment, because they show that Nkrumah was not only engaged with traditional African politics, as well as with the Leninist analysis of imperialism and its relationship to colonialism, but he was also more fundamentally thinking through the epistemological problems of classical Marxism, as well as, the philosophy of history and everything else. Okay, so we'll say more about that in a future video, but I do want to read an excerpt from Towards Colonial Freedom, which was drafted between 1942 and 1945. Which would have been around the time he was doing his dissertation work, but was finally published in pamphlet form in 1947, and then later in book form in, I can't remember what the specific year was, but it was in the 1960s. Okay, so the aim of all colonial governments in Africa and elsewhere has been the struggle for raw materials. And not only this, but the colonies have become the dumping ground, and colonial peoples the false recipients of manufactured goods of the industrialists and capitalists of Great Britain, France, Belgium, and other colonial powers who turn to the dependent territories which feed their industrial plants. This is colonialism in a nutshell. Okay, so this really shows the signature of his tutelage under C.L.R. James, his apprenticeship under George Padmore, and the mentality and the analysis that he had when he inserted himself in mass politics on the African continent. So he had revolutionary intentions the entire time, but as we'll see either in this video or the next one, there was a real question of how to translate the tactics of world revolution into the African context in post-World War II geopolitical struggle. Okay, so the next point that I wanted to make along those lines was that when we talk about Pan-Africanism, and we talk about George Padmore and C.L.R. James and their influence on Nkrumah, okay, we have to actually unpack this a little bit, because we did mention that Nkrumah gained entree with George Padmore through C.L.R. James. We said a little bit about what Padmore's background was, but we really didn't get a chance to talk about the Fifth Pan-African Congress, which is crucial enough to have a little tangent here, okay? Because it's at the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945 that the lines of battle are really drawn for the independence struggle after World War II, okay? So Nkrumah worked with Padmore as the co-secretary for the Congress, and there are three crucial aspects to the Fifth Pan-African Congress to keep in mind. The first is that in the previous Pan-African Congresses, which I'll probably say more about in a separate video series, there was no presence of the African working class, specifically the continental African working class. There weren't working class Africans from the diaspora widely in attendance at these congresses either. Okay, but as a matter of fact, much of the development of Pan-Africanism prior to World War II took place outside of the continent because of the intensely repressive conditions there. Okay, but during and after World War II, a lot of militant African trade unionists started to converge in London, Manchester, and other industrial centers in England. And George Padmore, being keyed into the global African working class movement for decade plus at this point, saw an opportunity when there was a conference of African workers near Manchester in 1945. So he drafted some of these trade unionists into the planning of the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester. So there was a presence of militant African trade unionists in the foundations of the conference, in elaborating the program of the conference, and there were African trade unionists from the continent for the first time in attendance. So the African working class in this program and in its declarations really rises to the foreground at this point in a very conscious way. The second important aspect to keep in mind is that for the first time, the international Pan-Africanist movement felt comfortable given the vulnerability of Western imperialism after the Second Imperialist War. It felt comfortable enough saying that, look, if you don't give us freedom through peaceful means, then we will use force as a last resort if necessary. So they saw the potential of the African masses to really make things uncomfortable for British, French, and other liberal capitalist imperialisms if they didn't get their independence through peaceful means. Okay, so this would be really important when we look at the actual development of the Gold Coast freedom struggle. The last aspect is the formal elaboration of Pan-Africanism as an objective. At the Fifth Pan-African Congress, the attendants declared that Pan-Africanism for them meant the total liberation and unification of the African continent under scientific socialism. Okay, this is a really important aspect of what it means to be a Pan-Africanist in the 20th and 21st century. There are a lot of people who are out there who call themselves Pan-Africanists. There are groups out there that call themselves Pan-Africanists. There are people who call themselves like offshoots of Pan-Africanism. And all of that is fine. But if you don't unite with that basic premise and that basic objective, as it was elaborated by Nkrumah, Padmore, Du Bois, etc., then you're really outside of the mainstream of the most revolutionary organizations that call themselves Pan-Africanist on the continent and throughout the diaspora. Okay, so those are three really crucial aspects of the Fifth Pan-African Congress that would lend their character to the African freedom struggles, first in the Gold Coast and then throughout the rest of the continent. So in this respect too, Nkrumah played a crucial role and a symbolic role in a sense for the subsequent development of the African independence movement. And we'll say more about his actual insertion into that movement in the next video.